as long as they didn't panic on me, as long as she would go along with what I wanted out there, okay? Go home, and that was it.
And if they didn't?
They stayed. She was poking her fingers up in my eyes. I just picked up the gun again and shot her. I carried her down the railroad tracks, and she went in the river. There's a dump down there, and just as you're coming out of that dump, there's one right in there. One there for the railroad bridge. Okay, there's one here. There's two down here, though.
Baker, churchgoer, devoted father, husband of an elementary Christian school teacher. That is the subject of today's video, which is the next in my Resurrected series, America's Most Evil. I'm so grateful to a dear friend for recommending this video subject to me, because before that, I had never heard of the serial killer before. The facts that follow will paint a chilling illustration of what criminal psychologists mean when they say intra-species predator, someone who quite literally hunts human beings. But beyond the typical psychopathic, sexually violent serial killer profile, what stuck out to me about Hansen was the unheard of levels to which he took his sadism and the drastic measures he implemented to ensure he alone would maintain control of these encounters from moment one until the last. A man who was leading two completely separate lives, working a day job as the friendly, harmless neighborhood baker, and by all accounts presenting as a pillar of the community, but who spent his evenings stalking prostitutes and dancers, posing as a modeling agent, and luring these workers away from their jobs with promises of big paydays. A man who made a heinous game of hunting his prey, typically very young and petite, defenseless women who'd been blindfolded and bound and flown deep into the remote Alaskan wilderness, where he could do with them as he pleased. Hansen meticulously planned his crimes to ensure his victims had zero possibility of escape. From my memory, there's no other killer who took it to this level as far as making sure there was no escape for his victims whatsoever. Even if they somehow managed to flee Hansen's grasp, there was still positively nowhere for them to run. No one around for miles to hear their screams. No roads to follow where they could eventually flag down oncoming traffic. Simply a void of winter's pale and the hair-raising silence of total solitude. If they escaped, they would have likely wandered for hours, maybe days, starved and dehydrated and frightened out of their minds before succumbing to the brutally cold Alaskan elements. By design, no one knew where they were except the man who stole them away to torment in his feral playground. It is suspected that some of the victims were even given a head start, meaning they were allowed to make their best effort of escape, only to be stalked down by the skillful hunter and his arsenal of deadly weapons. Ultimately, by the end of this malevolent little game, Hansen would board his single-engine plane to fly back home to the civilized world without them. There was a notion in Alaska that because it was such a remote and sparsely populated place, some girls traveled there because they didn't want to be found, or because they were running from their past. So this concept aided in the police having little motivation to go searching for certain types of girls who had gone missing. After the Alaskan oil boom in the late 60s and the completion of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System in 1977, which brought men into the area for work, the economy in Alaska prospered. This inevitably ushered in an era where prostitution and strip clubs thrived and attracted women to the area from all over the country. Some girls were even being recruited to specifically go to Alaska and dance. And by the 1980s, in and around Anchorage, several of these girls began vanishing into thin air without a trace. The mystery of their disappearances went unsolved for years, as they were not prioritized by law enforcement in the area due to many of the girls' chosen professions, and the fact that most chose not to use their real identities while doing this sort of work, which in turn made their social networks and their real families difficult to track back to any substantial leads. So their disappearances were largely dismissed, and for the few who did have concerned loved ones, well, they were mostly neglected. That is, until human remains began cropping up in the area, which made the previous disappearances impossible to ignore. In July 1980, in Eklutna, Alaska, skeletal remains were discovered near the highly remote Eklutna Lake Road, which lay amid a ghostly mountain range. The young woman was discovered by two electric workers who happened to be on assignment in the area. Can you imagine them being out in that disquieting isolation, digging into the ground for electrical work and running across a human body? Can you imagine how their blood must have instantly run cold? How they must still to this day be haunted by images of uncovering that first foot still wearing its boot? I dread to think of how long that poor soul would have gone undiscovered if they never ventured out there that day, since this particular area was so utterly forlorn and inaccessible to normal travelers. Seeing photos of her boots sticking out of the dirt is surreal and just so gut-wrenching. She's just there, hidden away in the dirt, lost deep in the vast, wintry wasteland, totally alone. No one searching for her, no one even aware of her name. To this day, decades later, we still do not know her name. My heart shatters for this poor girl, who was aged possibly as young as 16 years old and as old as 21. I cannot fathom what in her life led her to that place. What trauma or abuse or neglect led to her being off on her own so young, uncared for, and having to possibly sell her body for money. Then running across this soulless psychopathic freak who decided to make her pay for his own impotence and the fact that women were revolted by him. It suddenly became this poor girl's fault that he repelled the opposite sex, that he had bad skin, that he stuttered, that he was short and unappealing and unmasculine, and he took that rage out on her to mend his pathetic, fragile ego, and it still wasn't enough. Detectives would ultimately come to label the unidentified first female remains discovered Eklutna Annie. Based on her attire and jewelry, which included tall red boots, the investigators surmised she may have been a sex worker, like her killer would later claim she was. Due to her remains being so badly decomposed by the time she was discovered, forensic experts had to perform facial reconstruction to give the public an idea of what she may have looked like. I hate this photo so goddamn much. It's terrifying. This is not a human being. Literally no one looks like this. Not a single person throughout all of human history looked like this. I don't know who they thought would actually look at this reconstruction and ever think it was someone they'd known. No wonder the poor girl was never identified. Anyway, she was determined to have died by stab wounds to her back. That was all that could really be determined at that stage. Sadly, at the time, no further leads surfaced to direct the police to discover what had become of this young woman, and in a year's time, her case would go cold. The saddest thing about Eklutna Annie is that she could not be linked up with any of the missing persons in the area. Again, she was likely a sex worker and likely didn't have many loved ones concerned for her well-being, so when she went missing, apparently no one reported it. Months after Eklutna Annie was found, other girls started going missing. A second body would be discovered weeks after Annie's and was later identified to be 24-year-old Joanna Messina. She was a former dental assistant from New York who left her husband and moved to Alaska for a fresh start. She was described as a free-spirited hippie or a wayfarer of sorts. Robert Hansen admitted to meeting her on the docks in Seward, Alaska, and they negotiated hooking up. She of course ends up shot in the back like many of Hansen's victims, harmed while fleeing for her life. Mind you, this is all taking place while he is simultaneously posing as a faithful husband and a father of two, and the friendly neighborhood baker, smiling at the locals, hunting with his buddies on the same grounds he's burying dead girls, and kissing his wife at night after hooking up with countless prostitutes. This all went on for years. It is spine-chilling to know these sort of intraspecies predators are so adept at living completely separate lives while maintaining a good standing in their communities. That makes me want to take a second glance at everyone I know. So, next to go missing was a young woman named Sherry Marrow, who was a 23-year-old dancer at the Wild Cherry, a strip club in Anchorage, Alaska. In November 1981, not long after the first victim's remains were discovered, Sherry would vanish without a trace. It would become clear in time that the man responsible for the missing girls in the area had been using tactics that involved manipulating these girls, who were clearly desperate to make a living and far too trusting of skeevy men, into believing he could further their careers through modeling. Most women who enter sex work or stripping are looking for an eventual out and a way to advance their careers to legitimate fields. They use it as a stepping stone of sorts, because of course in our society, beauty is a currency. Modeling is a natural and somewhat safer next step for these girls. So this man heartlessly played on their greatest vulnerabilities, their need for security and money. One of Sherry Marrow's friends, Brenda Lee Fowler, who also worked at the strip club with her, said Sherry was lured away by a strange man who posed as a modeling agent and had made promises to them both of helping them with a career if they did a photo shoot with him. And because Sherry needed the money, she accepted the offer, whereas Brenda did not, because she was too creeped out by the man. In any case, Sherry left with this disturbing individual and consequently was never seen or heard from again. After a while, with zero new leads and having been unsuccessful in their attempt to track down the man who'd solicited Sherry, the case went cold, leaving her friends and boyfriend crushed by despair. Soon after Sherry's disappearance, other girls continued to vanish, and that list would ultimately include a 21-year-old dancer named Tammy Peterson in August 1982. She was originally from the continental US, and after winning a dancing competition in a club near Seattle, she would be recruited to dance in the clubs in Anchorage, Alaska. Tammy had been in contact with her family regularly since she moved to Anchorage at the age of 20, but after a few weeks passed with no communication, her family realized something was dreadfully wrong and reached out to police, which would prove to be quite futile. Robert Hansen was a calculated monster, and he targeted sex workers for a reason, like many serial killers, mainly because they're among society's most vulnerable and trusting, and they tend to make themselves readily available to seedy men who want to exploit them physically. That opens them up to a world of human filth and squalid working conditions and hideous minds that harbor sinister machinations, sort of like the Gilgo Beach serial killer or Jack the Ripper. Also, these girls and women often don't have the best social ties, nor loved ones keeping up with their whereabouts, so if they do happen to disappear, there's typically no one around to miss them. That's incredibly convenient to any man looking to prey on them. These girls also tend to end up in domestic abusive relationships for the same reasons. Also, there's always a matter of the police being dismissive of the disappearances of prostitutes and dancers. In this particular case, some were classified as runaways, and their loved ones were told they obviously wanted to disappear, so they wouldn't be wasting resources searching for them. This incompetent police work directly led to Robert Hansen going undetected for years, which enabled him to kill at least 17 women, but he is suspected to have harmed far more based on the evidence recovered from his home. After the third body was discovered in the same area, Maxine Farrell, a homicide detective and one of the first women to work at Anchorage PD, knew there was a serial killer at large. However, when she floated this theory by her male counterparts, her findings were all but dismissed. Still, because she was so personally driven to discover why these girls were going missing, missing and who was harming them and where these bodies were coming from, she began keeping her own spreadsheet of the known missing women and any information regarding their disappearances, because many of them were flat out not being investigated. Fast forward to September 1982, female remains would be found in a shallow grave near the Connect River. Through dental records, it was later determined to be the remains of the missing dancer, Sherry Marrow, who'd vanished the year before. She was determined to have been shot in the back 3 times. At this point, police did not draw the connection between the remains of Eklutna Annie and Sherry Marrow due to the differences in their manner of deaths, but they should have, because there were too many bodies cropping up around the same area, and all the girls were similar in build and age. And all of the cases would remain cold despite these new remains being discovered. Fast forward to June 1983. Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old sex worker, meaning a freaking minor, was out one night when she was approached by a man offering her $200 for a blowjob in his car. Straightforward, right? However, during their time together, he would put a gun to her head, bind her, and hold her against her will. Then he would later take her back to his house to do what he pleased with her, which was not a part of the agreement. Cindy later reported that this sick weirdo tied a rope around her neck and laid her on a bearskin rug before raping her in a den full of hunting trophies, while his wife and children were out of town visiting relatives. He then informed her he would be taking her to his private plane and flying her to his cabin, where he would make love to her once before bringing her back. But Cindy was smart enough to know that if she went with him to a third location, she would not come back. For his convenience, Hansen had purchased a 2-seat, single-engine hunter's plane with insurance fraud money he had obtained at some point in his long-storied criminal career. These planes are different than private jets, of course. Most significantly, they could access places other planes could not access. They could be flown alone. They could also land in shorter distances and take off from shorter distances, which was fitting for the sordid adventures this sick bastard had in mind. It basically enhanced his power and control over his victims to a terrifying degree, enabling him to basically airlift his prey out of town to remote places off-grid like some sort of demonic dragon. So while Hansen was busy loading his plane at Marrow airfield and moving back and forth from the trunk of the car to the aircraft, Cindy was left unattended. In that moment, she had a decision to make. Either sit there like an obedient little victim and wait for him to load her and fly her to her doom, or take her chances and make a break for it. Well, she was damn smart and seized upon that sliver of opportunity fate had presented to her. In that split second, Cindy had no idea she had become the hero of her own story, as well as the hero of so many other girls she would unknowingly help to save down the line. Despite her hands being bound and her feet being bare, she leapt from the truck and took her chances, running for her life. The sheer bravery it took for her to flee in that moment cannot be overstated. Again, at the time, she was bound by the hands, and she knew her rapist and kidnapper was armed with a giant rifle and could easily shoot her from afar. Still, she took her chances and bolted to seek help in oncoming traffic, whereas others in her exact situation might have been too paralyzed with fear to move and would have followed him onto that plane, having developed a sense of learned helplessness since he was armed. So it was the smartest decision Cindy ever made in her life, and thankfully, because she survived her altercation with this monster and wasn't cowed into remaining silent, she was able to lead the police back to the airport and point out the plane he had been loading. They were then able to trace the plane back to a man named Robert Hansen, and tracked him down to his home. When police arrived at Hansen's home, they questioned him, but after Cindy had escaped, he had worked on an alibi with a friend who lied and said they had been together during the entire altercation. Yet Cindy was still able to give specific details of what the inside of Hansen's home looked like, and when the police searched it, her story checked out, particularly the animal heads on the wall, which which were hunting trophies, and the bearskin rug on the floor. Still, Hansen was somehow able to lie his way out of culpability for what he had done to Cindy after offering the fake alibi. Because of this, and the fact that the police department was largely misogynistic and unwilling to listen to a female of any station, even their own colleagues, let alone a prostitute, Cindy's case was all but discarded. Robert Hansen was seen as the more credible of the two because he was married and was the local baker. But Robert Hansen couldn't leave well enough alone. The more he got away with his outrageous acts, the more emboldened he became, like a true unhinged narcissist would. A few months later, another body was found along the Connect River in September 1983 in close proximity to Sherry Marrow. She was also determined to have been shot in the back by a similar high-powered rifle. She would later be identified as 31-year-old Paula Golding, who had been a topless dancer that disappeared after telling her friends she was meeting with a man who promised to pay her hundreds of dollars. After Paula's remains were found, it helped to draw similarities between all of the remains and made police revisit the story of Cindy Paulson and take a closer look at Robert Hansen. One of the detectives contacted the friend that had been an alibi for Hansen during the Cindy Paulson attack, and soon this person came clean and admitted they'd lied to help him out. That's when the puzzle pieces began to fall into place, and all roads undeniably led straight back to Robert Hansen. However, there was still the pesky issue of probable cause to establish, which they needed to have in order to convince a judge to grant them a search warrant of the man's home. Eventually, after reviewing Hansen's deplorable past offenses, which I'll talk about later, the probable cause was clear and a judge granted the warrant. He was a career criminal. The investigators would cleverly execute the search on his home while simultaneously interviewing him down at the station so that he was none the wiser. And of course, like the disgusting, craven snake he is, he lied throughout the entire interview and feigned innocence. It was a pretty high-stakes situation at this point because all things hinged on discovering a connection to the bodies during this search. If they didn't find what they needed and he was allowed to go home and find out they'd been there, he would have the opportunity to destroy all evidence that linked himself to those crimes before they were ever able to investigate him further. They continued to grill Hansen while the investigators at his home came up empty again and again. But at last, in the attic, just before the police gave up the search and exited the home, one of the lead investigators decided to search behind the insulation in the wall. There, he would discover several rifles, including one that matched the .223 casings found near the bodies of Sherry Marrow and Paula Golding. They would also discover a bundle of jewelry, which he'd evidently taken as keepsakes from each of his victims. Trophies, if you will, much like the animal heads mounted in his den. After this bombshell discovery, Hansen was forced to come clean and struck a deal that he would confess to everything he'd done if they would only charge him with the few cases they were able to tie him to with evidence. So, hands tied and desperate to know the full scope of his crimes, the police agreed. Hansen would go on to be indicted by a grand jury of raping and kidnapping Cindy Paulson, the very girl whose story was originally discarded because of her chosen vocation, and who the entire damn state of Alaska had to thank for bringing this serial murdering piece of shit to justice. She finally got the justice she deserved and helped so many other women who had been terrorized and brutalized by this demon receive their justice as well. In Hansen's home, the investigators would not find anything particularly gory. However, they did discover several aviation sectional maps of the Anchorage Bowl area that were marked with X's or asterisks in areas where they had previously found bodies, like a demonic treasure trail of sorts. X literally marked the spots where his victims were buried, and by virtue of some of those X's corresponding with areas they had previously located human remains, it clued investigators into the fact that all of the other marks on the maps very well could have been additional grave markers, indicating additional murders. The fact that the X's numbered 21 in total was just bone-chilling. That means at least 4 other victims are unaccounted for, as he only confessed to 17, and I believe he confessed to several rapes as well. So approximately 7 victims of the total suspected have never been found or identified. Approximately 12 were located located by the police using those very maps, with the help of Hansen, who was flown out to these coordinates and giddily helped police locate his victims. Most were shot in the back, indicating to detectives that he either allowed the women to run and gave chase and basically hunted them for sport like they were big game animals, or they freed themselves and ran as far as they could before he shot them down like the worthless coward he was. Hansen didn't kill impulsively. He didn't even kill accidentally after transactional sex gone wrong, as he was wont to suggest when lying through his teeth about his crimes. Instead, he carefully planned his kidnappings, selected his victims with specificity, and created a ritualistic methodology that escalated over more than a decade, and would have continued for far longer had he not gotten sloppy with the disposal of the remains, and had he not allowed one particular victim to slip through his fingers that fateful day. According to Frank Rothschild, a prosecutor who helped secure Hansen's confession, he came across as a little mild-mannered sort of fellow. You didn't initially have any sense of what he was hiding behind the mask. It wasn't until we weren't going along with his program of how the confession was going to go that I saw a very different Robert Hansen. When that happened, his face turned red and the hair stood on the back of his neck. There was a monster. He acted out. He got really upset. He was screaming at employees for 10 minutes. I always get a thrill out of hearing the name John Douglas when I'm looking into a case, meaning the former FBI agent and one of the pioneers of the FBI criminal profiling, who was responsible for helping to coin the term serial killer. I love hearing his takes on cases, and John Bonet was another one he weighed in on, and which I mentioned in my last videos. But I learned of him not too long ago when I finally watched the hit Netflix show Mindhunter, based on John Douglas's book of the same name, in which he detailed his experiences profiling serial killers after interviewing some of the most notorious murderers in the world. He was basically a savant at pegging a criminal's identity and personality and even their proclivities down to the craziest nuances. And I just read across his take on Robert Hansen before his identity was known to investigators, and it just cements for me that Douglas's expertise, which was doubted in the earliest stages of his work with the FBI, has been vindicated repeatedly over the years. According to the website ATI, Douglas put together a psychological profile of the killer based on the details of the case and the injuries inflicted on the recovered bodies. He theorized that the killer was an experienced hunter with low self-esteem and a history of being rejected by women, and that he likely had a stutter. That is mind-blowing, because it is of course wildly accurate, even down to the stutter, which Robert Hansen infamously suffered from his entire life, and which can be heard in his confession tapes as he compulsively lies about the women he attacked and murdered and coldly discarded all over the Alaskan wilderness. We've all seen them, we've all known one. The dorky, glasses-wearing, acne-ridden weakling who no one speaks to and who no one acknowledges except to take account of how pathetic they are relative to the high school jocks and popular guys. The ones who are today more likely to become school shooters in the vein of Columbine or Sandy Hook. This is what we're dealing with here. A vengeful, deranged incel who grew up to be a serial murderer. These demented losers are the worst of their kind because, true to their form, they are weak cowards who take their retribution out on the innocent, those who had zero to do with their adolescent sufferings. But I suppose these are the monsters we create in our cruel, exclusionary cliques, in proliferating the world's rigid, unrealistic beauty standards that are completely unattainable for many, and then bullying those who don't meet them, or otherwise condemning them to a life of invisibility and loathing. These are the monsters we unknowingly foster through the years by merely discounting and ignoring them. That's what Robert Hansen was derived from. A lust for revenge on those he felt inferior to. I heard it perfectly said in one of the documentaries I watched about him. He is a grievance collector. To me, this is a form of narcissism I think most people aren't familiar with. Many of us tend to think of narcissism as grandiose, unabashed attention whoring, ostensible self-obsession. But there's a different sort of self-involvement and a different sort of attention seeking that some people are not privy to. And it amounts to what some psych experts call covert narcissism. On the surface, they seem normal, rational, unassuming, kind, yet underneath, they are anything but. They suffer from a relentless preoccupation with self-victimization. Someone who collects grievances like little martyrdom trophies and dwells on them and relives them without end. Always consumed with self-pity and in many ways plotting payback for every trivial rebuff they've experienced in life. This, of course, manifests in different ways. Sometimes vindictiveness in a relationship, often turning other people's wins into their own pity parties, always fishing for sympathy or compliments or undeserved praise, sort of like Robert Hansen lying about his hunting accolades and flaunting fake trophies. But also, these people enjoy making their partners feel guilty for achieving more than them or having a life outside of them. And in this case, in my opinion, Hansen's covert narcissism, or what I interpret to be his covert narcissism, not only led to him having zero empathy for the lives, feelings, and circumstances of others, but it led to him meting out petty vengeances without a cap to the measures he would resort to in doing so. His behavior became increasingly more irreverent and more violent throughout the years. From arson to lying about his hunting accolades and faking animal trophies to insurance fraud to petty theft to serial rape, to cheating on his wife, to stalking women, to kidnapping, and ultimately serial murder. He was a scourge on society, and in that case, it kind of makes you wonder what the hell went wrong. Born in Pocahontas, Iowa on February 15, 1939, Robert Hansen was the son of a Danish baker named Christian Hansen and an American mother named Edna Margaret Hansen. He mostly spent his youth toiling in the family bakery under the severe scrutiny of his father's watchful eye. This led to him becoming quite miserable, along with the fact that he was riddled with acne and small of stature, which made him feel unattractive, and he tended to stutter, so none of the girls his age wanted anything to do with him. In his own words, he looked like a freak and sounded like a freak. Therefore, he was as good as non-existent. While his friends got along well in the world and dated, he found himself envious of them, and was forced to spend his free time outside of school working a job he hated with his disciplinarian father. The one reprieve he found was in hunting and a fascination with guns, both of which gave him a sense of purpose and capability, and of course endowed him with a badge of masculinity his days at the bakery had failed to confer. In 1957, 18-year-old Robert Hansen joined the United States Army Reserve, where he spent a year of his life. Shortly after this is when he married his first wife in his hometown of Pocahontas, Iowa. By the age of 21 in 1960, he and another bakery employee would conspire to burn down a school bus garage as a way to get revenge on the society that had soundly rejected them. Hansen was later arrested when his accomplice confessed and was then swiftly divorced by his young wife after being sentenced to 3 years in jail. She was not trying to hold him down at all. However, about 20 months later, he was released early, yet later found himself incarcerated again for petty theft. Thus began a never-ending pattern for him, and a life of crime that escalated over time and varied in the extreme. He was just one of those typical, bitter, disaffected incels who developed misogynistic feelings towards women simply because they didn't want him. They didn't choose him. And in adulthood, he seemed to be enraged by the fact that women were only willing to be with him for money. He seemed to feel entitled to whatever woman or girl he wanted, mainly the ultra-attractive ones, redolent of the girls who had rejected him in his youth, and when they didn't want to be with him without money involved, a switch seemed to flick in his mind that set him off. So his killings became a sick form of punishment inflicted on those who would only engage with him in a transactional manner, a way of forcing himself onto the women who didn't want him in the past, and also a way of garnering unchecked control and the opportunity to play God, the exact opposite of his experiences in his youth when he felt so helpless and unseen. Question: why the fuck are women responsible for validating all men? And God forbid if they fail to, or if just one of those men manages to slip through the cracks, why are they then exposed to being violently attacked and murdered on a daily basis, even by their own partners and exes? I'm sorry, but it just nauseates me. The amount of women attacked every single day for no other reason than a man felt his entitlement to her body outweighed her autonomy, and in some cases, even her right to life. In seeking to bust one nut, there are men that rape and brutalize women, then murder them to cover up the fact that they raped them, treating these poor souls as though they're expendable, as though their existences amount to nothing more than an instrument to bring some random dude to a fleeting orgasm before their lives are permanently snuffed. That is the one thing about true crime that floors me every time. The number of women who have died because some man in some place at some time wanted to rape them. And for that, not only do they get raped, but they also have to die afterwards for his convenience. Hansen would ultimately move to Alaska at the age of 30 in the late 1960s with his second wife, Darla Henriksen, a Christian school teacher, and he became a baker like his father. Go figure. They would have 2 children together. But for some reason, that's when things began to fall apart for the insatiable Hansen. By the winter of 1971, he was driving down the street and crossed the path of an 18-year-old secretary named Susie. So not a prostitute or a dancer, just a random girl who was going about her business and who was not at all in any way soliciting him. He literally stalked her to her home, then knocked on her door and asked to use her telephone book. She let him in, sadly, following which he asked for a date, but she refused and said she had a boyfriend. Days later, this sick pervert returned and attacked her with a gun as she was walking towards her apartment. He then threatened to shoot her if she screamed, but she screamed anyway, so he was then caught by her roommates and the police were called. He was arrested and held until December 1971 when he was eventually released on bail. Later, in 1971, while this creep was out on bail and waiting for his court date for the attack on Susie, he met a woman named Patricia Roberts at a cafe. Again, not a prostitute or a dancer. No one that was soliciting him. He approached her with a gun and informed her that if she went with him and appeased him, nothing would happen to her. He restrained her hands, then later took her to a motel room and raped her. But somehow, Patricia managed to talk him out of killing her and throwing her down a steep ledge, and she promised she would not speak about what happened if he let her go. Hansen decided to believe her, and so he released her after taking her family's names and information as collateral, content that she wouldn't speak as long as he had this threat lorded over her head. But luckily, Patricia did bravely speak out to the police anyway, and he was once more arrested, this time for rape, in March 1972, after trial for assault with a deadly weapon for his attack on Susie and Patricia. Due to there being no evidence and Patricia not doing such a great job as a witness, reportedly, he got off on the charges against her. However, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for attacking Susie. This man was just a habitual jailbird, but kept managing to get back onto the streets no matter how frequent or horrendous his crimes. Sadly, after only 3 months into that 5-year sentence, Hansen was transferred to a halfway house, meaning he was essentially scot-free and was able to be released on a work program. He was once more permitted to stalk any woman he chose, especially prostitutes. In 1973, he was released on probation altogether. Having basically received only a slap on the wrist for rape, kidnapping, and 2 assaults with a deadly weapon, he was of course only emboldened to harm more people, realizing how easy it was to get away with preying on innocent women. After the assault charge against Hansen, a court-ordered psychiatric report was submitted by Dr. J. Ray Langdon on February 28, 1972. According to Justia Law, Dr. Langdon stated that Hansen Hansen suffered from a dissociative mental illness and suggested that Hansen's criminal activity stemmed from that illness. Dr. Langdon indicated that Hansen's type of disorder was difficult to treat successfully, but a subsequent letter from Dr. Alan H. Parker, filed 8 months later, indicated that Hansen had made sufficient improvement through therapy to warrant his release on parole. That is nauseating. In late 1979, Hansen was back out on the prowl and claimed to have met a woman who agreed to be with him for money. For some reason, he drove her out to a remote backroads wooded area and they got stuck on the terrain. He then claimed in his confession that she ran from him and then pulled out a knife when he gave chase in fear for her life, but he took the knife from her as she was panicking. Things got out of hand, he said, and he stabbed her. Of course, in his version of the events, everything is the victim's fault. She agreed to meet with him for money, so it was her fault. She pulled out the knife, so his stabbing her was ultimately her fault. She was freaking out and afraid, so it was her fault that things got out of hand and that she's now dead. This girl was left alone in the wilderness and darkness to rot. No one ever identified her as missing. No one ever knew what happened to her except Robert Hansen. This is the girl who would come to be known as the Klutna Annie. She was the first body to be found, but she remains one of his victims who has never been identified. And this brings us full circle to the beginning of the video. After the evidence discovered in his home and his confession, Robert Hansen would go on to be sentenced to 461 years in prison after a plea deal saying he would only be charged for the women the police knew of if he confessed to everything. He would go on to die in prison in August 2014 at the age of 75, and the world is a better place for it. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case below. I'll see you again very soon with another video, and this one will be from the opposite perspective. A video about a woman who was killing Johns. See you soon. Bye.